What happened that day when the Spirit arrived, when the Holy Spirit came? What happened then? It got loud enough to be heard all over town. Fire appeared, divided and dispersed to each of them. The outsiders came running, and they heard the fire talkers tell of God's mighty works in their own language. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, people from Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, Libya, Rome, Jews, proselytes, Cretans, and Arabians. The Spirit had come to describe the glory of God in their native tongues through those who followed Christ. These representatives of the world stood astounded but curious, bewildered but ready. Then Peter showed them from the Scripture exactly what it meant, revealing God's promise to all who trust in Jesus. And many believed, and many repented, and many were baptized, and many were saved. The Spirit had come. The church was born.
Morning. A bit dramatic, but that's the story for today. It's Pentecost. And so we gather around the Pentecost story this morning as we think about what it means to be the church, really. And the wonderful challenge of being in this coronavirus season. And I say wonderful not because, I want to be flippant about people dying or being in crisis, but because there is such a wonderful opportunity for us to rethink and reimagine who we are and what we're about and what it means for us to believe in God in many ways and what it is that God might be asking of us. So this morning I want to just talk about that story a little bit. What you've seen is I think a wonderfully dramatic sort of retelling of the essence of what Acts tells us, the book of Acts, happened when the disciples, having waited in Jerusalem beyond the resurrection of Jesus, into their growing confidence that this was indeed him, and then as I said last week in the ascension, Jesus leaving them to their own devices to discover not just that God was within them, but that it was very much in their failures and their learning together that they were going to become hopeful people for everybody. Today is about all kinds of things, but I want to say two things about Pentecost today. I want to talk about purpose, and I want to talk about language. So I want to start by sharing with you a photograph that I just love. I mean, a photograph of a cartoon. I've talked about Gary Larson and The Far Side before. I remember when I first saw this cartoon, and he comments on it in the prehistory of The Far Side, where he sort of talks about the genesis of this whole kind of way of doing observational comedy in his cartoons. And he talks about, I think, an encounter between his father and the boyfriend of his sister, something like that, where his father says, "The problem with you is that you just haven't found your purpose." So it's very small, and I apologize for that. But Edgar finds his purpose down the back of the sofa. Edgar finds his purpose. Whatever we make of the tongues of fire, whatever we make of the kind of dramatic, almost the miraculous in the story, whatever we make of the kind of spiritual aspects of the idea of God coming in spirit form, of touching the disciples' lives, of filling them, of giving them these almost kind of supernatural power to speak in other languages, fundamentally the change that happens in them, alongside other things that are changing, but one of the most fundamental changes is that they go from being, it would appear, timid and fearful and uncertain. They go to being people who know what their life is about, who know what their purpose is, or who have found purpose in their lives, which is a better way of saying it, because when you say people who found their purpose. It sounds like there is this thing they had to do and that they were kind of born to do from the beginning of time, which I don't believe at all to be true about the way that God engages with us and walks with us through life. So it's not that they found the track they were supposed to walk on, so much as that they found a meaningful path and a confident path and a path that they could walk together and alone into the future. However difficult it became, and it was hard for all of them, knowing why they were doing it and what it was fundamentally about. So I became, I started my journey into becoming a minister in 1990. I was sitting on a beach in near East London in South Africa, and I was part of a Scripture Union beach mission team delivering a kind of a teenage holiday camp type thing to the children of people in a caravan park alongside the beach. Beautiful place called Ganubi. I still want to go back there one day and sit on that beach again and revisit some of those memories from now almost 30 years ago almost. And then I would say I didn't hear an audible voice. I didn't hear God say to me, Rory, you should be a minister. I just had this sudden deep inner conviction that that what I was doing, which was studying materials engineering, was not going to be the path I should walk, and that becoming a Methodist minister in South Africa during that time was the thing to do. So I went home, talked to my mother. She wasn't massively surprised. She wasn't massively supportive, but and then went to go and see our local minister, who was very affirming about that. And I carried on as an engineering student for a while, thinking I needed to do some growing up, but quite soon realised that my mind mostly was in equations and physics and chemistry, but my heart was somewhere else completely. And so I left my engineering studies halfway through, 2 years out of 4 years completed, and went off to become a youth pastor in Cape Town, and then moved on from there to Pretoria, just south of Pretoria in South Africa, and then came across to the UK, and I've been here ever since. I guess I would say I found my purpose, but not in the back of a sofa, but I found the thing that I could do that would be deeply meaningful for me, and I'm glad to say I think has been deeply meaningful for other people. And it's not that I think God set me upon this path, that God kind of chose me, plucked me out of a crowd and thought, you're one of the great ones who will be a fantastic minister. Just that I had this deep inner conviction that my purpose was not to be a materials engineer, manufacturing industrial diamonds for abrasives and for cutting, or any other part of what that might become in management further down the line. So there's the question of purpose. And it's a luxurious question, because for most of the world's population, they don't get to choose what they do with their hands and their minds. They engage in work that might be menial or seemingly trivial or almost inconsequential, or very small at least, in the impact it has on the lives of other people. But aren't we learning every day how the smallest cogs in this great machine of this economy and world of ours are somehow many of the most important ones? It's not been that long in the world's history that so many people have had so much choice to wrestle and explore what their purpose is, or at least have the opportunity to use better language to find purpose in their lives. Of course, part of their purpose for the disciples, part of what they discover, is that they have a voice, and that their voice has something to say, and their voice has something to say to other people. But it's in languages, to start with, that are not their own. And that's the most important thing I want to talk about today. The importance of speaking in other languages, learning other languages. When I started my formal training to be a Methodist minister, I lived in 1996, so not long after Nelson Mandela was released and our first elections had happened. Within a year and a half, I was living in an entirely black community of about 15,000 people in a township just outside a little town called Fochville in southwest of Johannesburg, about 100 kilometers from there. Me and them. Me as their minister alongside 6 other congregations I had, one of which was the largely white congregation in town. And it was an extraordinary year. Extraordinary year. I lived in the township. The police visited me fairly regularly because they really weren't sure who I was or why I was there. And it took the community a little while to work out how to just be okay with each other in the normality of me living there, because white people hardly ever went into the township. They dropped their domestic workers off on the outskirts, and the police went in, and that was about it. In that township, there were migrant workers working in the mines. It's a gold mining area, speaking Xhosa, a language from an ethnic group in Black South Africa whose kind of home was over 1,000 kilometers away in Eastern Cape, and then Sesotho, which was quite local, and Setswana, which were a little bit further north, but kind of languages that had a lot in common. So there was Sesotho, Setswana, Xhosa, a little bit of Zulu, all kinds of language groupings in that community. And I worked out early on that I could only preach in English. I could only lead in English, but that I could at least read the words of the liturgies in the other languages. And it was quite a dance really to learn preaching, especially because I would preach with 2 interpreters. I would speak a sentence or 2, and then it would be translated into Setswana and then into Xhosa, and I was never sure how the translation went in terms of its accuracy. I had to get used to the fact of having my mannerisms and everything copied as well, so that those who were translating did that as well. But to preach in 3 languages simultaneously with the help of 2 other people was quite an experience. And as many of you know, my wife Rebecca is German. I met her and her English was impeccable because she's lived and worked in Australia and America and other places. But I had to catch up on the beginnings of German quite quickly. I'll never forget the first time I went to visit her in Germany, and walked up the path in the evening, having arrived quite late on an aeroplane, into her parents' sort of living room, and the 3 of us, or the 4 of us, really just sitting looking at each other, because they had very little English and I had almost no German, and Rebecca obviously had both. But it was awkward. It was difficult. But now they are, they're my parents, and I love them. And their English is better, and my German is better, and we're learning as we go. I want to point out one thing very, very strongly, and I can't say it strongly enough. When the disciples begin to speak out of their sense of purpose, they do not speak in their own language. They do not speak out of the familiar. They do not speak out of the places where they are comfortable and where they feel at home. They speak in other people's languages. They speak in the languages of people from, as you saw in the little video clip, from all over the Middle East and further afield. They speak as the outsider. Or they speak to the outsider in the outsider's language. They speak to the foreigner in the foreigner's language. That's so important. It's probably the most important thing in this entire story. Whatever we make of the tongues of flame, whatever we make of the the kind of miraculous aspects of it, it is just something the church keeps forgetting, and has done through all of its history. The beginnings of the church happen in the lives of people who find purpose to communicate the thing that they've discovered about their belovedness in God and about God's love for all people, but that the first words they speak are not essentially their own. They are for the ears of other people. Now, I don't know what your church experience is, if you're watching this, or what you like about church, or what's frustrated you about church, or even what's hurt you within the church's life, because many people have been properly wounded by the humanness in its smallest forms of the church, of a gathering of people who come with all of their brokenness and wounds and prejudices and everything else. But the language of the church is churchy so often. We do things that are not things that get done a lot in many other places. Just recently I was reflecting on a comment I heard or saw somewhere. I can't remember where it was, but it was part of thinking about reimagining church and saying, for most people in British society, singing in the company of other people is something they've never ever done since they were at school. And yet, certainly as Methodists, it's so central to who we are, so central to what we think we should be, so bloody important that even in this last few weeks, as we've been exploring online and in Facebook groups and so on, the possible reopening of our churches, there are people who've said as Methodists, like, I won't go back to church until we can sing, because if I can't sing, then I don't feel like I'm a Methodist or a Christian. And that's okay. That's okay. But what if we're trying to be in the company of people who don't do that at all? Should we assert our culture, our way of doing doing the exploring and affirming and expressing of faith, and ask others to join us in their discomfort in that? Or should we risk not singing at all, or singing less, sometimes even, so that others don't get put in that awkward position where they're not sure what to do? It's one example, just one example. The language of the church is not helpful in so many ways, and I say this to myself as I scratch my head about what the possibilities are that lie ahead for us beyond COVID, and even now within it. How do we learn the languages of people who do not connect with us? How do we stumble our way into trying to express things in ways that aren't comfortable for us, aren't familiar for us, aren't easy for us, but that are about honoring Pentecost, honoring the birth of the church, which begins, as I've said already, and I'll probably say it again a couple of times before the end of this video, begins in the deep sense of purpose that arrives into the disciples, the confidence that comes with that, and I'm quite sure, the discomfort and the bewilderment even of not using their own language as they begin to talk about this wonder of the love of God. If you get a bunch of ministers in a room, it doesn't take long before they start having a good bitch. I could say moan, I could say other things, but it doesn't, I think that's the right word to use. And we moan about lots of things. We moan about hierarchy. We're essentially, it's funny, I mean, we don't take holy orders in the Methodist Church, but we agree to be in deep communion with each other in a way that is as selfless as possible. But many of us are just so anarchic as people. We butt up against authority. We do all kinds of things. It's good to have a moan every now and then. Sometimes the things we moan about are important things, and they are the way that church locally, never mind in any of its wider and more diffuse forms, church locally can become so unable to speak anything but its own language, which fundamentally is shaped around an act of worship on a Sunday morning that includes a certain number of hymns and a certain pattern with a good 3-point 15 to 20 minute sermon in the middle, and 1 or 2 or 3 Bible readings, and sitting in rows facing forwards, not sitting around tables for conversation. We become so institutionalized into our own language, our own way of doing it, that we can't break free from that. And I know ministers who have been literally broken by the unkindness of people who just can't begin to imagine God outside of the language that they have used to frame God. And some of that language is actual language, some of it is arcane and archaic. Some of our hymns are about things that I don't understand. I mean, we have lots of words in the church that make no sense in any other context, and that we often trot out, and I think if you stopped the average Methodist and said, what do these words mean, they might fumble their way through an answer. But without being unkind, I think most of us would struggle sometimes to say why we say and do the things that we do in the way that we do them. It's because it's our language. It's because it's our vocabulary. This is our vernacular. And vernacular is a good word, because vernacular is about what is local and comfortable and culturally kind of framed within the place that we are. But the church begins in other languages. And I honestly, and I'm not alone, believe that the future of the church lies in a return to the church in Acts. And some of that is very much about the radical generosity that comes immediately after this passage, the radical sharing and the kind of bluntly socialist impact of social impact of and socialist impact of the teachings of Jesus on the understanding of having goods in common, having the common good in common, and generosity, kindness, justice, fairness, all those things. But at the same time, returning to the early church in the way that we reimagine church today absolutely has to mean finding the discomfort of the languages of other people in our lives as we fumble our way into speaking what we know, showing what we know, living what we know. And maybe an essential part of that is the dismantling in many ways of the vernacular of church. It isn't a bad thing, but it is a fairly two-dimensional thing for those who know it, for those who are familiar with it, for those who find it comforting, for those who find it affirming. Those are good things, but it is two-dimensional. It is limited, and it is not speaking sense or meaning into the lives of the very people we are trying our best, I hope. And I really mean that, I hope, because I think sometimes we're not trying our best to love into God's love. So it's becoming a bit of a rant, and I'm sorry about that, and I'm going on a bit, but I think it's important this morning to talk about church beyond COVID and Pentecost as the starting place for us in so many ways. If we are serious about not just the survival of the church, but the growing of the church and the health of the church's life, wherever it is, whatever form it takes, that has to begin in a radical willingness, at least, to be the disciples, opening their mouths, speaking foreign languages. Now, I don't actually mean that we need to learn Swahili and French, and I mean that nothing is sacred in the way that we have framed God. Nothing is sacred in the way that we have framed God. And so everything is up for grabs. Everything is up for reform. Everything is up for expanding. Everything is up for actually getting rid of and moving on from, or finding entirely new ways of expressing. Before it sounds like I'm saying the Lord's Prayer and Holy Communion and a bunch of other things can just be done away with. No, but can we reframe them? Can we reimagine them? Can we, And maybe you're sitting there listening to me thinking, yes, but into what, Rory? How? And my answer is I don't know. I don't know. And that's one of the great discomforts of this, that we have to overcome, or at least we always have to live with. I've been part of a couple of webinars, never been in a webinar before, but I've been part of a couple of webinars put on nationally by the church to explore what it means to be the church beyond COVID. And I have to be honest, the second one that I was in a week and a bit ago, I left early because, again, I don't want to be unkind, and I'm not being unkind. But I just found myself so frustrated by the institutionalization of so many people who were there, just saying, how can we get back to doing what we were doing, and tweaking the edges a little bit so that maybe just it becomes a little more accessible. When in fact I think the invitation of God right now is for wholesale reform. In a sense, to pack our bags, not leave our buildings, but become fellow strangers together in a new world, learning to articulate the things that matter to us, and willing to try and fail and risk and trust each other because we know that there is a purpose that we have, that is the sharing of God's love. So this has been quite fun doing this techie stuff during COVID. I've learnt a lot. I've had to replace my computer, the new one sitting on the floor. Ironically, as the new one arrived literally yesterday, my old computer has started to behave itself perfectly. But there you are. But, this is not about language, the language of technology. This is about fundamentally what we say when we use it, amongst many, many other things. What do we want church to look like? What do we want it to feel like? Where do we think it happens? What do we think it means? What do we think our purpose is? What languages are we not speaking that we could try to learn to speak? Why are there not young people in our churches? Why are there not as many families as we would like to have? It might be about the words we use. It might be about the times we meet. It might be about all kinds of things. But how are we going to try to find out? And what are we going to do about it? And what will we stop doing that is precious to us in order to make those things possible, even if they fail and we learn something from them to try again in another way? Pentecost. This isn't, the story of the disciples discovering their magical powers. This isn't about them being sort of, fundamentally useless without God, and then poof, God is in their lives, and then rah, everyone listens and everything proceeds positively. It's not about that. It is about purpose, not down the back of a sofa. It is about the thing we think our life is about, and how we might begin to grab hold of that more in the privileged position of being able to do that in the first place, because fundamentally all our other needs are met. And secondly, and I'll say this as I close, it is about learning other languages. It is about fumbling our way into new cultures, new ways of being church, new ways of being ourselves, new ways of being British, new ways of being Northern, new ways of being, all the things that we might use as labels for ourselves. They aren't diminished because we do them in a different way, but are enhanced and grown and become, hopefully, more open, welcoming and inclusive. God asks us to give ourselves away. The gospel is about learning to give ourselves away. It is not about learning to cling to the things that are precious to us, for whatever reason, and however precious they may be. It is about at least being willing to explore the possibility of those things being much less precious to God than they are to us. And it is about turning our eyes to the outsider, to the stranger, to the one who we are not communicating with in any way that is really helpful and really transforming, and asking how we might stop being ourselves the way we are and become a different kind of ourselves in a way that invites and includes and welcomes. I feel strongly about this. You've worked that out by now. I feel strongly about this. I have the privilege of being part of two churches' lives who are not averse to these questions. And I'm grateful for that. I'm really grateful for that. But what does Pentecost mean to you? What skin are you in? What is your language? What is your culture? What is your expectation of church? What is your Britishness? What is your humanness? What is your whiteness or blackness or any of the things we might use to frame our lives? And can they be open to reinterpretation, to reimagining, to perhaps expressing just as authentically in very different ways? That is God's question for us today. And I hope that you're up for it, because if we don't, as a church, if we don't grasp the nettle with these things, if we don't take seriously what the early church looked like, beyond the generosity of having too much and giving some of it away, writing letters to our MP, doing things that are about social justice and equality, if we don't locally where we are, and that begins perhaps and always in the hardest place, in our families, in our friendship circles, in all kinds of ways, if we don't ask God to help us to learn the new languages that we need to learn in order for others to find what we've found and more, then I wonder where hope lies. I am hopeful because I believe that in the infinite creativity of God, there is an infinitely creative opportunity in you and I to do Pentecost today. So are you up for it? How about it? And how can we explore that and the discomfort of it together? Because that's essential. Sitting in the discomfort of it, as we say, I don't know what to say or to do or how to go about that, but I don't want to just be who I've been and do the things I've done the way I've done them, sing the songs we've sung and say the words we are familiar with. What can be new, different, surprising, and transforming? Pentecost in 31 minutes. Apologies for going over what should be about 20 minutes, but I think it really matters today to say these things, and I hope you've been willing to listen to the end, and bless you if you have. And if you want some conversation about this, then drop me an email or pick up the phone. Loving God, help us to be the early church today. Help us to be the disciples, moving from fear to purpose. Purpose beyond fear. Help us to be the disciples, learning in the bewilderment and the confusion of it, to communicate your gospel and your life and your love to those who at the moment don't seem able to hear it because we are not speaking the same language. Amen.